Thanks, Josh, and good evening, young people. Well, as I said this afternoon, it was a great link that the committee made to bring these two chapters together. We're going to see how infinitely they actually meet together tonight to bring out the principles that we looked at this afternoon. And we're going to see tonight a king who, from the very same experience, made a different choice. A king who, not like Nebuchadnezzar, who actually decided to change his life for the better. A king who saw exactly the same event and didn't change his life. So we're going to see the opposite tonight in King Belshazzar. But as I said, we're going to start off tonight just having a look at the stump that was left over from the Babylonian tree. And it fits really well with what we're going to talk about tonight. What does it all mean? Okay, the stump. The tree was cut down and the stump was left in the earth. It was banded with a band of brass and iron, and the dew of heaven fell on it. What's it all mean? Well, what we have to do in all of the scriptures, we're trying to interpret something, is look at where those things are used in other places in scripture. The band of brass and iron. When the first time we read of brass and iron, and unbelievably it's together, and it's in Genesis chapter 4. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 4. We want to establish what this stump that's left in the ground really represents. Genesis chapter 4. And it's we're going to look at verse 19. And Lamech took unto him 2 wives. The name of one was Adar, and the name of the other Zillah. And Adar bare Jabal, and he was the father of such that dwell in tents and of such as have cattle. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all that such as handle the harp and the organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. So here we have the first occasion where we read brass and iron together, and those things were created at the hands of Tubal-Cain. And Tubal-Cain means the offspring of Cain. And we see Grandad, he was the one who took himself 2 wives. He wasn't happy with one, he wanted 2. You go back to the beginning of the chapter, and what was the spirit of Cain? What was Cain's big problem? Well, he was asked, of course, to bring an offering, and what he brought was not acceptable to God. So verse 4, Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof, and Yahweh had respect unto Abel and to his offering. Verse 5, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. And Yahweh said, Cain, why are you angry, and why is your countenance falling? He said, if you do well, don't you know you'll be accepted? If you do what I ask, you know that it will go well with you. And if you don't, you know that sin will consume you. What happens? What was Cain's problem? Well, Cain was saying to God, God, don't you tell me what I have to bring as an offering. I will give you what I think's appropriate. So Cain, in the record of the scriptures, is the first person who stands for everything that is in open opposition to God. God comes and pleads with him and says, Cain, you know what's right. And you know if you do it, it'll go well. He says, no, I'm doing it my way. So then, this boy that's named Tubal-Cain, which means the offspring of Cain, he's the first one to introduce brass and iron in a family that has multiple mothers, like 2 wives. So you see that when we start to look at these symbols, we see right from Genesis, it's the spirit that has an open rebellion against the things of God. It's not just a slow development and evolution of ideas. It's actually a concentrated effort to be in opposition to God. No, I will not be told what to do. Now that's really important that we understand that. Okay, So that's the first time we read of that. Let's go over to chapter 10 in Genesis. And we read here, reading from verse 8. And Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty hunter, or mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. He was a mighty hunter, as it means, in the face of Yahweh. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter, in the face of Yahweh. So he was challenging Yahweh. I'm a great man. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, and the land of Shinar. And of course, we know in the next chapter, the Tower of Babel was built in the land of Shinar, Babylon. And it was in open opposition to God. They were to build a tower so that God could never flood them out again. They were going to make a tower that reached unto heaven. They would lift themselves up in opposition to God, in a concerted effort. It wasn't just happening. We have to understand that about this chapter that we're reading, right? It didn't just happen. They didn't just go, oh, let's build a temple. Well, maybe we can build a nice tall building. No, they built it purposely to defy God. Try and flood us out now, God. We're going to build a building that's so tall the water won't cover it. And that's the spirit of the stump and the band of iron and brass. Okay, let's go back to Daniel. The dew of heaven. What's the dew of heaven? Well, if we go through the scriptures again, if you go through all the scriptures that talk about the dew, it's always about the prosperity from heaven. And if the dew's withheld, like when Elijah came and withheld, there was no dew nor rain for 3 years, nothing grew. So dew always spoke of the blessings of God on the world. Deuteronomy 32 verse 2, we can have a look at this one. This is probably one of the loveliest verses about this. Because this is one of the wonderful things that we have in the truth, young people, is that we've got to see the truth and the word as being something special. It's something that actually gives you life. It grows you. So Deuteronomy 32 says, my doctrine shall drop as the rain, my speech shall distill as the dew, as a small rain upon the tender herb and as the showers upon the grass. So it's life-giving. So the dew always speaks of that blessings from God that gives life, that gives growth to things. For those of you who live in Glenlock, you probably don't know what dew is, right? It's that wet stuff that comes when it's a bit of humidity in the sky, right? At night time. Okay. But there's another aspect of this. So that's what we've seen historically. The brass and iron represents the spirit of Cain. Don't tell me what to do. We've got Babylon, the stump, the tree that was actually there. It was a spirit of open rebellion to God. You said you want to have one wife? No, I'm going to have two. And I'm going to be a mighty hunter. I'm going to be more important than you, God. People are going to see me as more important in the earth than you. I'm a mighty hunter. I'm famous. But we also know from Daniel chapter 2 that the brass and iron have another significance, don't they? And what are they? Does anyone know? You're allowed to say. Part of the kingdoms of men, isn't it? Which parts? Remember Daniel chapter 2? The brass were the Greeks, iron was Roman, wasn't it? So there's got to be a link in the book. You know, they're using these symbols. There's got to be a link. So there was this band of brass and there was a band of iron. And it was on the stump. So now we look at it looking forwards. What does it stand for? So this Babylonian tree, it was up there, it was cut down, but the stump was banded with brass and iron. Why would you band a stump with brass and iron? Why would you do that? You want to see a steel post on a jetty or something with a big steel ring around the top, like a wooden post? Why do they put steel rings around them? To stop it from splitting. That's right, to stop it from decaying. Water gets in the top, opens it up, rots it all out. So this band of iron and brass was on the stump to hold it together, to stop it from rotting away and falling apart. All right? So the Greeks and the Romans would support this stump. What is the stump? Can we know what's the stump? It's pretty basic. Okay, it's the roots of Babylon. It's the foundations. What Babylon was based on, that's what the roots of a tree do. They supply the tree. So this tree was Nebuchadnezzar's image and his kingdom that all the people flocked under, but the roots were the foundations of that. And what were the foundations of Babylon? We looked at it in Genesis, didn't it? It was in its opposition to God. I'm going to do it my way. Don't tell me what to do, God. So the stump then represents the roots or the foundations of Babylon. So the Greeks and the Romans, let's go over this. The Greeks and the Romans would hold together the stump of Babylon. Right? They would stop it from rotting away and disappearing. And that's exactly what we've seen through history. That the Greek and the Latin kingdom, the Roman kingdom, picked up all the ideas and philosophies of Babylon, and they preserved them in a system of philosophy. All right, so Greek and Roman metaphysics, you ever heard of that? Like, it's the basis of most modern philosophy, where they've took all of these ideas from Babylon and preserved them, and they made it into a system. And the system, at least a facet of this system, is seen as in the Roman Church, where all the ideas of Babylon have been incorporated through the Greek and Roman languages and their ideas of life and multiple gods and all sorts of things, and made it into a system. So Babylon still remains today, doesn't he? That stump is preserved, that it's preserved by the Greek and Latin philosophies of life. They took all that stuff, all the sciences and maths from Babylon, and the ideas of creation and what it was. And all those ideas have been preserved by the Greeks and the Romans. What about this dew of heaven? What is it? If we saw it was God's blessings and doctrines, what we're looking at there is a picture, young people, of the Acts of the Apostles, at least in part, where the Greek and Roman world where they were showered with the dew of heaven. In the Acts of the Apostles, we read the fact that in the Apostles' teaching, they turned the world upside down with their preaching. And we got to the year 300, what happened to the Roman Empire, the pagan Roman Empire? It became a Christian empire. Not a true Christian empire, but it was a false Christian empire. But because of the preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that whole empire became Christian under the hand of Constantine. I know it's a bit of history, sorry. All right. But that's how powerful this influence was. And of course, we live in a time period where that is still happening. That the stump of Babylon is still strongly preserved. All the thoughts and foundations of that system that started in Babylon is still alive today. So not only does the Roman Church fit that picture, what else fits the picture? And I think the Roman Church has influenced it this way, is that any institution, government or whatever it might be, who promote things that are in total opposition to God. That's the spirit of that stump. Anything that's in opposition to God. So the Bible it's very simple about our origin, but not the Greeks and the Romans. They had all sorts of ideas of where we came from. And they had a guide for every part of life, because they didn't want to accept the message of the true God. And so Babylon would remain, and it's alive and well today. We know it remains right up, doesn't it, until Revelation. Let's have a look in Revelation. Revelation 17. Have a look at this. So we read about Babel in Genesis, which is started by a man who was proudly in opposition to God. We read in Revelation chapter 17, we read about a woman who was arrayed, verse 4, in purple and scarlet colour and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand full of the abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. So here when we read in Revelation of this system of Babylon the Great, here it is again. They are so much in opposition to God that they are drunk with the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus. They're not just a system. It's a system that is in opposition, violent opposition to God. I know I'm pressing this point, but this is what we need to understand. The things that are happening in your world, young people, are not just happening. They're orchestrated. And it's a push to be in total opposition to God. You go back to Revelation chapter 12, we read about this system. So, we see this woman with this name of Babylon the Great in chapter 17. Back in chapter 12, we get another picture. And here we're given this strong message, of course, that Babylon has existed from Genesis right up into Revelation. Verse 9 of chapter 12. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the world, the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Now, without going into what this is all about, what we're being told is that this system known as the great dragon was the same thinking as the serpent, all right, the Satan, the devil of the Old Testament, exactly the same. It's a system that is purposely in opposition to God. And that's what we're going to have a look at tonight. That's the opposite to what Nebuchadnezzar was. So don't be deceived by the things that you see around us in the world today. Don't think it's just a natural progression. What's happening in your world has been put together with a purpose, and that purpose is to destroy your conviction of God. That's what it's there for. You might think that's a bold statement, but I think as we look at Daniel chapter 5 tonight, we're going to see that. So let's go back to Daniel chapter 5 and see what we can find out, because this is so relevant to you and me in our world in which we live. And I think it helps us to be much more aware of how diligent we need to be in our understanding of the truth and our conviction of what's right and what's wrong. So we're going to see in this first four verses here, or first four verses, the spirit of Cain, all right? So Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. So here he's in this big feast, right? And he's got his wives and his concubines there. Whilst he tasted the wine, he commands to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines might drink therein. So you see the situation. They have this great feast, and the feast has started, right? And he's starting to drink the wine. And obviously, as he starts to drink the wine, he loosens up a little bit. And then he makes this momentous decision. While he's tasting the wine, he says, no, I've got a great idea. I want you to bring all the vessels of the God of Israel that Nebuchadnezzar brought out of Jerusalem. Bring them in here. Bring them in here. This is a great opportunity, right? So he says, okay, let's do that. And they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem. And the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines drank in them, and they drank wine and praised the gods of gold, of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood and stone. So you see, it didn't just happen. It didn't was just, we got something to drink out of here. Oh, yeah, that'll do. No. This was an orchestrated effort to decry and to belittle the God of Israel. All right? This was open rebellion. He knew what he was doing. Let's bring it in. And not only did he just use the cups to drink the wine, while he drank them, he praised the gods of wood or gold and silver and brass and iron and wood and stone. You might ask the question, why does it say wood? You could have put, if you'd put in clay there, you'd almost have Daniel's image in chapter 2. But you think about what happened. What happened in Daniel chapter 3 when they said that, when they made that image, and Nebuchadnezzar made the image of gold, he didn't take the parts, gold, silver, bronze. He just said all gold. That's me. I'm beginning and ending. I'm the whole lot of that. Well, what Belshazzar does, he knows the story, as we'll see later on. He knows the story of the tree. And so what he does, he praises the gods of gold, silver, brass, iron, and wood, which is the word tree. And he knows that the tree of Babylon was cut down by the God of heaven. And he goes, no way. I'm going to worship the tree, the wood. See, it's in total opposition to what he knew had happened. And look at him. He's got his wives and his concubines. Harks right back to Genesis, doesn't it? Where men first moved away in total opposition to what God had set forth was right, what was right. And he totally ignored God's message. What was it that was driving him? It was pride, wasn't it? He looked at Nebuchadnezzar and he thought, what a fool he was. What a fool he was. And the world's going to look at you and think, what are you doing with your life? You could be somebody in this world. And you go, I am somebody. I'm somebody that God intimately knows and has got an amazing future ahead. A life that we can't even get our head around at the moment. An amazing life of creativity, of care and of love and of stimulation. A life that's going to change the world, and I'm going to be part of that. So the place is going to be a beautiful place. I'm somebody, but I'm somebody in God's eyes. I don't care what people think of me today. But that wasn't Belshazzar. He had to make himself big, didn't he? It's like Herod. When he bought John the Baptist's head, he wanted to make people think he was great. So this is the man who, in open defiance of what he'd learnt from his grandfather or his father, Nebuchadnezzar, he stands in open opposition to God. No, bring in those things and let's praise the gods of this world while we're using the cups of the God of heaven. But what happens? Verse 5, in the same hour. Now this is something we all need to take note of. In the same hour, God is always watching. And sometimes we think, well, why does God let this happen? Regardless of whether God reacts or not, he is always watching. That's what Nebuchadnezzar recognised. He said, there's a watcher and a holy one. And he directs all the things that happen in my life. He's got watchers everywhere. And Nebuchadnezzar believed that because God rules in the kingdom of men. And these people are everywhere, these angels. They're watching all the time. In the very same hour came forth the fingers of a man, and he wrote on the wall. And what happened? While in the midst of this spirit of arrogance and pride, God takes the opportunity to show this man his folly. He didn't have to do this, but he does. And what happens? We see a man in verse 6 who has a life-changing experience. A man whose life was changed forever. But unlike Nebuchadnezzar, whose life changed, that he might have hope of eternal life, this man's life changed and he became dead forever. The difference was with this man is that he saw the writing on the wall. He saw it with Nebuchadnezzar, but he ignored it. And when that writing on the wall became physically visible, it shook him to his core, but it was way, way too late. So we had opportunity. We all have opportunity right here and now. All right? We can see the writing on the wall. We're going to look at it a little bit further in a minute. We can see the writing on the wall in our own lives, in the life of the world in which we live, that the kingdom of men is about to come to an end. It's now that we've got to make a decision to respond to that. Because when that writing becomes visible to the world, it's too late. And look what happened to Belshazzar. He was shaking all over. The joints of his loins were loose. He just had no strength whatever. His knees smote together. He was absolutely petrified. But that fear wasn't a life-changing fear, was it? He was feared for his own pride, his own position, his own life. And what does he do? First thing he does, goes to the wisdom of the world. It's what Nebuchadnezzar first of all did. And of course then he tries to buy off these people. Listen, he said, if you can tell me this, you can be the third in the rule of the kingdom. Why does he say the third in the rule of the kingdom? Why does he say that? Well, actual fact, up until the turn of the century, people didn't believe, critics of the Bible actually denied the Daniel record, said, well, Belshazzar never existed because there was no records of Belshazzar because he actually wasn't the king rightfully. But archaeology has since found there's that tablet there as well. We don't have to read it all. And there's another tablet there in the British Museum which talks about Belshazzar being the regent or the ruler while his father Nabonidus was away further afield in the empire. And we have heaps and heaps of records now of the fact that Belshazzar did exist, that he was looking after the kingdom for his father Nabonidus. And so obviously then he says, well, if you can tell me the mystery, then you can be the third ruler. It seems odd if he was the king, why he'd say third. But the reason is he had no power to give him anything higher. His father was the ruler, he was the second one, and whoever would give this interpretation would be the third ruler. And of course, that was an attractive promise for the people of the world. But they could not read the writing nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. And then the king was greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. There was no answers. I want you to have a look in Luke 21, because this is sort of where we are, isn't it, in the world. We look at the coronavirus. We look at Ebola. We look at some of the wider problems in the world, the financial crisis, hunger, political unrest, terrorism, and then, of course, in our own society, bringing a bit back home, teenage suicide and the problems associated with that. You look at this world and they go, is there any answers? Do the people in the world have answers to these problems? Everybody's hanging their hopes on the vaccine, aren't they? I don't know whether it's going to be the cure-all of this problem or not. But everybody's looking for answers. And they hang on this answer. That's the only thing they've got is a vaccine. But really, all the experts don't know if it's going to actually be effective in the long term. So what happens here? You have a look in verse 25 of Luke 21, talking about the time of the end. There shall be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things that are coming upon the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And then shall see that the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. So just before the return of Christ, we're going to have a situation in our world where all the wise men of this world will not have the answers to our problems. And then the world starts to fear. And I think even in Australia, as we've only been touched lightly with this problem. I am so surprised at the enormous amount of fear in our community of coronavirus. We are absolutely petrified. And that's where we are. That's our world. They don't have the answers. And that's where Belshazzar found himself back in Daniel chapter 5. He sought for the answers in all the wise men and no one could give. And then his troubles grew greater. Well, there's no answer to this. What's going to happen? Then the queen, of course, remembers Daniel. She heard the commotion, it says in verse 10. She heard the voice of the king, and she obviously knew that he was in trouble. His countenance had changed, and she says, there is a man in the kingdom who can tell you the interpretation. So you just imagine, if you knew there was a man who could tell you the interpretation of dreams, and he'd done it several times in your history, and to your father/grandfather, whoever Nebuchadnezzar was, who would you go to first? Now, we all know, don't we, that God has all the answers for our life. All the big issues of life, the world has no answers, but God has them all. But do we always go to the Bible first? Do we? Or do we seek other help when we find ourselves in difficult times? Where do we go? Belshazzar had seen before the example of Daniel and had totally dismissed it. And the Queen reminds him of that. Now, I want you to have a look at the list of things that he talks about with Daniel. This is amazing. This is Daniel's full profile. Now, if he had a Facebook page, this is what it would read like, right? And we talked about this afternoon. I think this is something we need to aim for, right? Just have a look at these things, right, that are listed here in verse 11 to 12. He was found to have insight. He had good judgment. He had wisdom like the wisdom of the gods. He had knowledge, he had judgment, an extraordinary spirit. He had the ability to interpret dreams and solve riddles and untangle problems. That's the man that you've come to study this year, Daniel. That's the man you want to be like, isn't it? That's his profile. And that's from someone outside looking on. This guy is completely dedicated to his beliefs. If there's a tough question, he will find it out. He'll go home and he'll pray and he'll study and he'll come back with an answer. That's who we got to exemplify. That's who we need to be like. That's the Daniel that we want to be. We want our friends to see and come up to you and say, Elliot, I'm struggling. I've got a pretty hard question. Can you help me out here? I don't know what to do here. Or whoever it might be. Is that what we do? And do we have friends in our meeting that we know that we can go to get good spiritual advice? Or do we know people who might give us that and we don't go there because it's not what we want to hear? That's what Belshazzar did. I don't want to hear Daniel. I don't like his interpretations. So he went and he made an effort to try and get the wisdom of the world, and there was no answers there. But here, Daniel is brought before him. And he says, are you Daniel, with the children of the captivity whom my king brought out of Jewry? My father brought out of Jewry. I've even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men and the astrologers have been brought in before me that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the king. And I've heard that you can make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler of the kingdom. It's almost like he said it because he had to. Like, I've heard about you. Well, if you can do that, you can be third in the kingdom. As if like, well, you won't be able to. Because none of the wise men could. Now notice Daniel's response. He wasn't taken in by the offer of the gifts, was he? You'll be third ruler in the kingdom. All right, you do this, you'll be the CEO next year. Okay, you just got to go away, you've got to live in Arabia for 6 months. Then Canada for 6 months. Don't worry about your wife and kids, that's fine, but you'll be the CEO by next year. All right? And Daniel goes, not interested in your gifts. Not interested in your gifts. Don't try to bribe me with things. I don't need them. I know the God of heaven and I know he looks after me. He rules in my life. I don't need your gifts. So beware, young people, of the gifts the world offers you. They will offer you all sorts of wonderful things. but they all come at an enormous price. And nearly always the price is give up the things that really mean most to you in your life. And I work mainly with tradesmen in construction. And I can tell you that probably 80% of construction workers, tradesmen, are depressed. They earn lots of money, they're doing well, but they're depressed. And you know why they're depressed? Because their wives and kids have left them. That's a fact. I'm not making that up. And they come to work and they say, I don't care if I don't wake up tomorrow. I don't care anymore. They've worked their whole life and they realise that the things that were most important to them they've neglected, and when it's gone they realise what they're missing. That relationships and close relationships are the most important things in your life. And the world we live in doesn't care about your relationships. They want to just use you up for their benefit. And if your relationships fall apart, well, we'll get somebody else if you can't cope. And that's my experience in the construction world. I don't know what it's like in the corporate world. But when the world offers you gifts, they all come at a price. And Daniel was not prepared to pay that price. And he kept his conviction of the things of God, regardless of what happened around him. Let's read on. What happens? He says, listen, I don't want your gifts, but I'll read the writing of the under the king. Verse 18, he says, and this is basically a summary of chapter 4. He says, O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honour. Right? He acknowledged that. Nebuchadnezzar did. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. But when his heart was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory away from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. So he said, you remember this, Belshazzar. You remember exactly. This is part of the interpretation. You know that, don't you? That's your history, Belshazzar. But you've not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. What a challenge that is, young people. What a challenge that is. He says to us, you know what? You didn't change. You still went on in your own selfish way, even though you knew that what you were doing was in opposition to the will of the God of heaven. And not only did you did it arrogantly, and you prided yourself in it. Young people, do we ever persist in things that we know are wrong? Do we ever continue in a lifestyle or activities that we know that God's not pleased with? That's human pride coming out. And when we know it's not right and we continue to do it, that's open rebellion. This was the spirit of Belshazzar. Yeah, I know all that, but I don't care. I'm going to keep doing this, whatever it might be. That's the spirit of Cain from the very beginning. Don't tell me what to do. But you see what he did, verse 23? You've lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and have brought in the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords and thy wives and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver, gold, brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, that the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, thou hast not glorified. What an amazing thing that is. What an amazing thing that is. He says, you have praised the gods that don't see, all the things of this world that the world promotes. And he says, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways thou hast glorified. This is a pagan king. And Daniel says, you've ignored and abused the God who puts every breath into your body, Belshazzar. He's a pagan king. You go over to Matthew chapter 5. Let's have a look at this. We need to know this, you see, because everybody in this world is dependent upon God for every breath that they take. Matthew chapter 5. This is the mark, this is the hallmark of God's wonderful character. We're going to pick up in verse 43. He says, ye have heard that it has been said, thou shalt love thy neighbour and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good. He sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. If ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Because even the publicans do the same. And if ye salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans so? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. So the mark of God's greatness is the fact that he provides food and shelter and breath to the evil and to the good, to the just and to the unjust. And the difference is the just acknowledge it and the unjust deny it. So it doesn't matter who they are. They're all being supplied in life by God. Every single thing that breathes on this earth is dependent upon God. The choice we have to make is whether we acknowledge that or not. That's the choice we make. And that's the choice that Belshazzar wouldn't make. He said that God was nothing. Let's go over to Acts chapter 17. This is Paul in Athens. Probably the pinnacle of Greek philosophy and teaching. And they were so superstitious. And they had so many gods that they had an altar there to the unknown God. Just in case we've left one out, we better give him an altar. And Paul comes and he says, you know what? I'm going to tell you about that unknown God. What a fantastic way to preach. So he said, I'm going to tell you about that unknown God that you don't know about. And this is what he says. He picks up, we might pick up the record in verse 24. God hath made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, and he dwells not in temples made with hands, neither is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing as he giveth all life and breath and all things. Can you imagine that in the Greek world? This God made everything. He doesn't dwell in temples. They had temples to everyone in the Greek world. And he's not worshipped with men's hands as though he needs anything. It's not that he's a big-headed person who wants all our worship so he can be praised. But he says, and he gives us all life and breath. And he's made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth, and hath determined the times beforehand appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As certain of your poets have said, we are also his offspring. So he says, God is in touch with all of us. He keeps us all alive. From the pagan Greeks to the faithful in Israel. They all depend upon God. And Nebuchadnezzar recognised that. But Belshazzar stands in open opposition and says, no. And the pride in his heart would not let him accept that God was greater than him. And the question is, of course, for all of us is, we know this. We need to take hold of our pride and swallow that pride and make decisions that we know God would be happy with in our life. So we see here it's not just a happening thing that they just inadvertently took some cups and said, let's just use these. It was a special choice by Belshazzar to choose the things that came from the God of Israel in open defiance of him. That's the spirit of Babylon. That was the spirit of Cain in the beginning. I know what you want, God, but you're not getting it. I'll give you what I want. The spirit of Lamech, the spirit of the Tower of Babel, the spirit here of Belshazzar. So we live in a world and we see the stump still alive today, held together by Greek and Roman philosophies. That's still alive. It's still preserved. And it's open opposition to the things of God. I'm going to have a look at this, just have a look at a few little things. And you know, if we ever wonder sometimes, you know, God gives us these amazing signs to tell us that certain things are absolutely part of the kingdom of men. You know, sometimes we can be deceived and we can discuss and argue about what's right or what's wrong or what we should be get involved in, what we can't. But you know, sometimes God gives us enormous signs that something's wrong. All right, something is glaringly and obviously in open opposition to him. And I'm going to show you one of them. And have a look at the word they use. That's the kingdom of men. Now let's have a look at what God says. Let's have a look at if this is really true. Genesis 1, we know what Genesis 1 says, isn't it? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Okay, so what do we come up with? We come up with the theory of evolution, where God's word is arrogantly abused, isn't it? And then we have people who try to blend these two ideas together, if that's at all possible. But here it's not only just happening, it's in open opposition to God. The very first words of our Bible is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But we come up with a theory where there's no God at all. That we are the arbiters of our own destiny, that we are the rulers in this kingdom, that God doesn't have power to rule. So straight away, there is this is a theory that's an ideology, a philosophy, all right, that of course has been nurtured by the Greeks and the Romans, that God did not create the heavens and the earth. He had no part of it. What about this? In the beginning, God said, when he created man, he made them in the image and likeness, and he said, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over the cattle and over the earth and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. We are different to the angels. Oh, we are too. Different to the animals. And the reason we are different to the animals is that we've been given an intellect that understands moral things, don't we? That's made us bigger and better than the animals. This is the crazy world we live in. This is staggering, all right? You've all heard of the mouse plague, haven't you? You got a wakery? Nothing to eat there, is there? No. But there's a mouse plague going through the middle of Australia, South Queensland. There's also now in the York Peninsula. It's really huge, right? It's a big problem. This has come up in the news 2 days ago, right? People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals said the bright and curious mice shouldn't be poisoned, and that accepting such a death for the rodents would amount to agreeing with the dangerous notion of human supremacy. All right? I want to touch on the point of mice being less important than humans. I think that's definitely speciesism, which is something that we at Peter are strongly opposed to. It's the worldview that puts humans above any other animal. See, these things don't happen. It's in open opposition to the word of God. That God says, no, we are way more important than animals. We have a calling that's higher than the animals. All right? Much higher than the animals. And he says we have dominion over. That doesn't mean we squash every living thing that we see. That doesn't mean that at all. But we exercise an authority over them that preserves our heritage. But Romans 1 tells us, doesn't he, that what happens is that they start worshipping the creature more than the creator. And then what happens, God says he gives them over. When they start that point where the creature is more important than the creator, he says he gives them over to a reprobate mind. And they choose all sorts of alternative relationships. And the world ends in anarchy and disaster. That's what he says in Romans chapter 1. So these things are not just happening. They're things that are in open opposition to God. You know, you think that humans are above animals. That's speciesism. You horrible, repressive creatures, you. But God said that's what it is. We are far above animals. And we should treasure that. Doesn't mean we lord it over them and kill them all, as I said before. But it means we exercise an authority which we use our heads to realise that sometimes we need to exercise dominion. What about this one? In the beginning, God created male and female. When he created them male and female. No, that's not right. Gender's a choice. Just because God said he made them and he makes you whichever what you might be, that's not the case. It's a choice. You can decide whatever you want to be. You can read the dribble if you want to, but you know, that's only a sample of the sort of, you know what I'm talking about. You know the world you live in. It's not just happening. This is open defiance of God, that everything, all the fundamental issues of life are being attacked. This is orchestrated. The movement through America is orchestrated. I've got a thing on the computer here to show you that this whole thing is orchestrated. It's not just happening. And the really interesting part about the guys who actually put together this organisation are Marxists. And their first rule to take over the world is anarchy. And that's what they're doing. They're creating anarchy. And they're taking everything that's stable in your world and taking it away and throwing it out the window. And there's nothing right or wrong anymore. God at the beginning, it was all black and white. Bang, I created this world. There's male and female. This is what marriage ought to be. No. It's got to be flexible. Genesis 2, the laws of marriage. He made a man and a woman. You leave your father and your mother, or you can't even use those terms anymore. In the University of Australia, they want us to say gestational parent and non-gestational parent. You can't use father and mother. All those old ideas have moral connotations. And you shall cleave unto your wife. What's the world done? It's changed the whole concept of marriage. And they've stolen the rainbow. That's not just happening. This is an orchestrated effort to destroy God in this world. So don't just think it's the evidence of Babylon today is in the Catholic Church and its pagan origins. It's the spirit that goes through the world where it says, God, you will not tell me to do anything. I will do what I want to do. And that's the spirit, young people, that's in the world that you live in. And that's the spirit you're taught to have by our world. So you have to make a decision. Do you want to be a Nebuchadnezzar or do you want to be a Belshazzar? Join in all the feasting of the world and celebrate all the stupid things and all the wonderful things that the world's got to offer, so-called? Or do you want to be a Nebuchadnezzar and realise who we really are? But, you could list a whole heap of things. The role of fathers. It's openly attacked. The role of mothers, the discipline of children. Sexual morality. Commitment to marriage and the pursuit of wealth and pleasure. All these things are attacked in our world. And it's something as young people we need to look at ourselves and say, what are our values concerning those things? Are they biblically based? Can we actually have a list of Bible verses that actually show us what the role of a father is? I look at the list of things like child abuse, and I'm not denying that child abuse happens. Parenting is disgusting in our world today. But the list of things that are listed as abuse are things that are the responsibilities of good parents, like controlling their spending, controlling their habits, controlling who their friends might be. That's abuse in our world. And yet God says, as a dad, that's what you should do. So, as young people, your mum and dad are probably, hopefully, they're telling you yes or no to things you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing. And maybe advising you places you can go and can't go. God says, that's what I want you to do as a mum and dad. But the world says, your parents can't tell you anything. So the world in which you live in is not just a slowly evolving idea. It's an orchestrated effort to destroy God. And we've got to see it as that. This is Belshazzar. Let's make a point about this. There's the other thing, of course, in our world. Have a look at this. The most recent current events. I just thought I'd just bring one up. The Gaza-Israeli debate. Oh, was it more than a debate? An exchange of rockets. All right. It was more than a skirmish. But have a look at this. This is what came up. Putin told Netanyahu Russia could declare war on Israel amid Palestinian row. It's a threat to their security. I don't know how it is, but it is, right? This is what's happening in our world. Now, you know what the Bible says about Russia and Israel, don't you? What does it say? Russia will declare war on Israel, right? We know that the final scenario, Ezekiel 38, all right, 39, that Russia will be opposed to Israel, come down to destroy them as a nation. It's not happening yet, but there is a sign that God says the writing is on the wall. The writing's on the wall. Everything we look at in this world is opposed to God. Everything we look at. And what we've got to decide tonight is, can we read the writing on the wall now? Because when the writing becomes declared to the whole world and it's on the wall for everyone to see, it's too late. And there'll be fear and wailing and gnashing of teeth. We've got to make the decision now. So the writing came up. Mene, tekel, upharsin, didn't it? And again, it's pretty simple. The answers are in the Bible. We don't have to guess what it means. Numbered, weighed and broken. That's the idea of it. Your kingdom's been put in the balances. I've checked it all out. It's no good. So what we've got to remember is the scales belong to God. He's the one who puts the scales up, isn't it? It's not you and me. It's not the arranging brethren of the ecclesia. It's not whoever. It's God. He is the one who sets up the scale. And he's the one who puts us in the balance. So I'll put you in the balance, he said. The scales belong to God. Remember that. In the ultimate end, the scales belong to God. So you don't answer to me, I don't answer to you. I answer to God and you answer to God. So we need to know what God wants. He rules in the kingdom of men, doesn't he? That's what he rules there. That's why he holds the scales. And he looks at our world today and he sees, way on this light side, he sees his wisdom is really light on. And he sees the pride and arrogance of man being brought heavier and heavier upon our world. And not only is it being brought on heavier in the world, it's becoming legislated for. And they're passing laws to say that you can't speak against it. Who knows what's going to be ahead of us, young people? I don't know what's going to be ahead of us. As a community, we stand in open opposition to their ideas. And legally, at this point in time, we could be all classed as criminals because of our attitudes. But thankfully, we can still meet like this. We still have opportunities to be open about our beliefs. But who knows if that's going to change? Who knows if we're going to have to stand up like Daniel, to stand against the fiery furnace, or to stand up against the den of lions and put our life on the line for our belief. We don't know. I don't know that. I pray that it won't happen. But the writing is on the wall. You can see it. We've seen it tonight. It's there. There is this open opposition to God that's alive and well, and they're protecting it with laws. So the kingdom of men has been weighed, totally weighed in the balances, and it's found wanting. So you can imagine this great scene. Belshazzar, it's over. So what does he do? Verse 29. Belshazzar, they clothed Daniel with scarlet, put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be third ruler in the kingdom. Did Belshazzar believe the writing on the wall? Did he? Of course he didn't. Of course he didn't. Oh, make Daniel the third ruler. Within hours he was dead. And the gift that he gave to Daniel meant nothing, did it? But we know that Darius could see the wisdom in Daniel, and he was used in that kingdom. But that's next chapter, so we won't talk about that. But he didn't believe it. Yeah, okay, thanks for the message, Daniel. I'm doing what I'm doing. Bring a grave, make Daniel the third ruler, because I'm still the second. Young people, the kingdom of men is about to be destroyed. Well, you can believe it or not. That's up to you to decide. If you think it's true or it's not. But it's going to happen. It happened to Belshazzar. He didn't believe it, but it happened. And because he arrogantly went on and did what he continued to do, his life was taken from him. So God has given us amazing signs. Amazing signs. And he's done wonderful things in all of our lives. He's put this writing on the wall. There's this amazing thing that, at the beginning of last year, looking at current events, and I looking through the European news papers, and every single newspaper in Europe, every single one, from France News to Moscow Times, French 24, all the big newspapers in Europe, and they all had the same caption about Putin. He's a colossus with feet of clay. He's nothing but a giant with feet of clay. Every single newspaper called him a giant with feet of clay. Now look, if that's not a sign from God, if that's not the writing on the wall to say, I'm still in control, remember Daniel chapter 2, I'm giving you a little reminder that it's all still happening. The writing's on the wall, young people. And now is the time where we've got to decide which kingdom we're going to be of. The kingdom of men, which is about to be destroyed, or behold and take hold of the kingdom of God, which shall stand forever.